Hello everyone. Ohayo gozaimasu minasan. Good morning. And today we will do our countdown for my top 30 Stephen King books. Of the 30 I've read, this is where I'd rank them. Of course, there is many other books that I haven't read yet. So if you don't hear them mentioned in this list, don't feel bad. If anything, it might be that I didn't read them yet, and that's why they're not on this list. But if you have ones that you think are crucial for me to read as well and would help improve this list, feel free to leave comments regarding such. And like I said, please take into consideration that with art and with any sort of entertainment, even literature, opinion is open interpretable and everybody is going to be different. With Stephen King, he goes all over the place. So some people like different books better than others. Me personally, this is where out of the 30 that I have read, I would rank them and rate them. But of course, this list could change as I read more in the future. This is just for the 30. Now, he's written over 70 books. So, eventually, if I read them all, I would love to come back and do revisits of this list as I read more to see how it changes for one, and also see like if that's where I definitely keep them or not. So, with that said, we will get into the countdown starting at number 30, and without further ado, here it is. Number 30, we have Cell, which had an amazing opening. The first 30, 34 pages or so were incredible. And then overall, I actually enjoyed this book until about 180 pages in. And then it lost everything that made it scary, everything that made it suspenseful. And it just became really silly and dumb. And I didn't really care for all the characters that much. The one female character I did kind of like, and then when they killed her off, I really checked out. That by the time the ending came around, I just couldn't wait to be finished with the book, being honest. And that's why, like, it's at the bottom of the list, and it's not to say that it's completely terrible. If you've never read it, I think every Stephen King book is worth reading at least once. But this would not be a popular reread just for the. I'll put it this way, near the end, the way he's connecting all the dots to tie up the story, he literally separates certain characters from the main character and then, like, in a stupid way, kind of reunites them that the whole separation was almost pointless. And then the way it ends with everything else, it's just, it left me really confused for one thing, but then it even the interpretations of how it really ended kind of seems stupid to me. So, yeah, at number 30, Cell, that's where it sits for me. Not to say that it's completely shit. I think there is a kernel of something good in this book still. But overall, would not be one of my favorites. And I could at least say, so far where I'm at with my Stephen King journey, that there is at least 29 other books of his that I like a lot better. 29, we have Roadwork from the Bachman books. Now, Richard Bachman was the pseudonym Stephen King used to write early in his career under when he would write more than one book in a year because his publishers considered it a bit taboo to release more than one and didn't want the author competing with themselves. So, these had a different feel to them, and eventually he started writing in that sort of direction as Bachman. But in the beginning, it was Stephen King, and the first two are perfect examples of they are Stephen King, but they were just marketed under the name Richard Bachman. This one, the third one we're talking about, Roadwork, actually seems like he did try to be a little more Bachmanish, but then there's elements of it that really make it a traditional Stephen King story. Now, the action and the subplots and the drama throughout the story with the drugs, the hitchhiker, dealing with gangsters, blowing things up, the standoff at the end, which is epic as hell, those parts are great. Now, the constant tie into the emotional grief that this man is experiencing, you can understand that it's actually beautifully done in a way which doesn't kill the story completely, but it does weigh it down. Had this just been more like The Running Man, straight action, this could have been a better story, whereas the grief could have maybe been put into a better story and channeled better, and it would have turned out beautiful in its own way. But overall, it's not the worst. It's just not one of my favorites because it was really depressing for me to read, and I just didn't have a good experience reading it. But overall, it's not the worst book ever, and there actually were some parts I did thoroughly enjoy. So yeah, 29 road work, and overall, not bad. Number 28, we have The Tommyknockers. Now, this is a book that I could say I love and I hate because the parts that I love are incredible. Like some of his ideas in this story are some of the most like unique and cool and captivating ideas Stephen King has ever come up with in his entire career. Like they're out there, but like wow, like genius. There's strokes of genius in this. But at the same time, there's a lot of filler. There's parts where it seems like because he was going through a process of being heavily on drugs at the time, a lot of cocaine, probably marijuana, drinking, all that, there's a part where it seems like he blacked out and just didn't fully explain how we got from point A to point C. Like point B is just not mentioned. And it's something to do with Guard's character and Bobby. You'll notice it's around the time he comes back and she's pointing a gun at him, and then the next we hear of this tension that's going on, she's sleeping in her bed as if nothing had happened. So like I never figured out like did she just leave and go to back to bed, or like it just didn't explain that, and it seemed like he blacked out and forgot to explain that or something. And then yeah, like I said, the filler really weighs it down. There's I'll put it this way. Guard is the most unlikable main Stephen King character ever. Like when he's ranting on for 30 pages about nuclear power and reactors and energy and bombs and all that, he's just going off and it's so annoying. Like I wanted to punch this guy after reading those 30 pages. But overall, the idea of him with aliens, the way he takes it and he comes up with the radiation sickness from the ship and everything. I love those parts. So overall, there are parts I love about this. I think it is worth reading. Just keep in mind it is a slugger at times to get through, and it can be kind of overwhelming and confusing because it really is out there, which thank God he sobered up and got his focus. This book was kind of a wake-up call for that. So yeah, 28, The Tommyknockers. 27, The Running Man. Another one of the Bachman books, which the reason I have the Bachman books is because one of the stories in it, Rage, is out of print because of its connections with real life school shootings. So because of that, it's very difficult to get a copy of Rage, and I kind of got these other three with it just for that sake. I wanted to read it. I wanted to see what the fuss was about. But The Running Man, I can actually say, was the second most enjoyable story for me at least in this whole book because I didn't really care. Like Roadwork was second bottom. This I liked more than the Tommyknockers because it was focused and because of the quick paced, action packed suspense of the story. Overall, the story is great. I get why some people say the characters didn't really have many dimensions and they weren't very memorable or likable, but overall, the story itself kind of outweighs any of the character flaws. Like the story itself is actually a pretty cool concept, and it's gripping and intense and right to the end. Like I'll put it this way. There were parts that were so intense, like I laughed not cuz like they were stupid or funny, but laughed because of how like intense and wild the story became. But at the same time, that's what makes it really good. And of course, they made it into the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, which I hear is quite a bit different. Now, overall, what I liked about the story though was how well, while this guy Richard is playing the game, he comes up with all these strategies to elude pursuit and hide, and his ideas are actually brilliant, which to see him make it as far as he did in the game, that's like why the story is overall so good. But yeah, that will put in at number 27, The Running Man, and definitely a good one. 26, Four Past Midnight. Now, I did enjoy all four novellas in this one, which are The Langoliers, The Library Policeman, Secret Window, Secret Garden, which is actually second story, Library Policeman's 3, and then the Sundog is 4. Now, I saw the mini series of the Langoliers before reading this, so that story wasn't the most enjoyable for me, just because I already knew what I was getting. And what I could say is the mini series is actually a very faithful adaptation of this. Not many changes. The only thing that I really noticed was very different was the fact that there was another passenger on the plane who was sleeping most of the trip, and he just never was aware fully of anything that was going on. I kind of like the humor of that was hidden in there. I actually think they should have thrown that part into the miniseries too, because it adds something that's unnecessary, but it kind of lightens the story a bit, which I felt like the story needed because there were some pretty dark, intense moments in it. Now, Secret Window, Secret Garden, I actually think did a better job than the movie Secret Window with Johnny Depp. The change at the end is a lot more effective and intense, and I really liked how that ended. With the Library Policeman, actually probably my favorite in this, and I loved it because it was so wild and out there. I didn't know what the hell to expect. And as I'm reading it, like it got so fucked up at a certain point that I was like, oh my God, like this is a dark and powerful story, but it wasn't afraid to go like everywhere. Considering it was already talking about such a dark, controversial subject, it did not shy away from all its weird elements that really just made an incredible creation, which is why this book actually does better than some of the other ones. Like that alone was a standalone moment that beats the Tommy Knockers as far as like aliens and stuff. And then of course the Sun Dog I really loved as a story because of Pop Merrill's backstory, which it also acts as like a prequel to Needful Things. And for that I also really love that story. So overall, like four good novellas. I like The Library Policeman most, which is probably not a popular opinion, but just because it's so wild. For me, it's going to fall in at 26. 25, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Now, this one originally got and wanted to read because of the short story The Night Flyer in this. I saw the movie with Miguel Ferrer, loved it, and I was like, I gotta read that story, see if it's as good or better. If anything, I actually think the movie is one of the few exceptions that is better than the story. However, there are some really good gems in this book. Like, I'll basically point out some of my favorites, although all of them left a pretty big impression with me. Overall, I actually felt that this story collection was underrated because the stories that are really good make it worth reading, like 100%. Like Dolan's Cadillac, very good. The end of the whole mess, pretty interesting. Suffer the Little Children might be my favorite. The Night Flyer, Popsy, both pretty good. It Grows on You was probably my least favorite. Chattery Teeth, I liked that one just because it was wild. It was kind of zany and out there, but it works, right? Dedication was just a bizarre story. I didn't mind it though. It was kind of interesting. And then the moving finger, that was just weird and kind of creepy. I like that one. Sneakers, that wasn't bad. That to me felt like a Richard Bachman story almost. And then they got a hell of a band. I really love that one. Home Delivery, that was a good one too on the whole zombie take. I actually think that is better than Cell, to be honest, as far as like a zombie story. Home Delivery is better than Cell. And then Rainy Season, I love that. I'll never look at Toads the same after that story. My Pretty Pony, another Bachman story, which I thought was really beautiful and profound, and I was glad he like included it. The Sorry Right Number was made into an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. Never seen it, but I like the screenplay in the story. The 10 o'clock people, I love that. Like the whole ties into smoking. Like it creeped me out because I'm a smoker. So I was like, oh my God, man. It made me think twice about smoking. I'll put it that way. And then Crouch End, I really like the Lovecraftian sort of British vibe where he takes it to England. You never see a Stephen King story in England, right? And then The House on Maple Street, that was a cool one. The fifth quarter wasn't bad. I like that because it was another sort of Bachmanish story. And then The Doctor's Case was Stephen King's take on a Sherlock Holmes story with Watson solving the case. I really like that one because I like Sherlock Holmes, and I thought Stephen King actually did a very good job at this one. And then Umney's Last Case might be one of my favorite stories. Just really good and freaky because the metaphysical aspects of it, it's great. And then Head Down was a beautifully written story because it wasn't horror or anything, but it was based on a true story. It was based on his son's little league adventures, and in my opinion, it is a great story because it's based on a true story, and then the way he writes it is really moving, and you really feel like shit that this could have been something he made up, yet it was real, so it's just that much more impactful and beautiful. And then Brooklyn August is this short kind of dumb poem at the end, and then he's got another like sort of hidden short story where he's talking about the bagger and the diamond, which is based on like an Indian tale or something. Pretty good. But overall, that's why I say, like, you heard me discuss a little bit of it. I thoroughly remember this book and I did enjoy it quite a bit. So, yeah, it falls in at 25. So, the thing is, because there's only 30, it's not to say that I don't like any of these books. It's to say this is where they would stand overall if I was going to say, do I like this one better than this one? Do I like this one less than that one? And that's where it basically rounds off my list. But yeah, 25 Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Number 24, the long anticipated sequel of The Shining. Now, Doctor Sleep is actually a really good book. And I think that it's better than the movie because the book actually serves as a sequel to the book. And there is a lot more of a continuation of sequences that is more smooth and accurate. Whereas with the movie trying to mirror the differences from the original Shining movie, I feel like it hurts the balance of what Stephen King was going for with the story. And had this been its own thing, this could have actually perhaps even been a better book. But it's not that the tie-ins to The Shining hurt it. It's just that it's standing as a sequel after so many years to a behemoth of a book, which is The Shining. Like The Shining is so much higher up on the list because it's timeless. It's a masterpiece. This is actually a fantastic book. And the references to The Shining really do put icing on the cake. However, because of the time difference and the fact that we're not quite getting the same story we got in, the prequel of Doctor Sleep, it that's kind of what weighs it down. But overall, I can't say I don't like it. As a whole, I actually really enjoyed this book, and I think because I read The Shining right before I read it, that actually enhanced Doctor Sleep. So The Shining doesn't hurt it. In fact, I think they actually both complement each other well. But if you didn't read The Shining, you might not enjoyed. And then I would also say if you hadn't read The Shining in a long time and then read this, it might not be as memorable to tie into the other characters the way it would be if you read them back to back. So overall, though, I can't say it's a bad book. I did really enjoy reading this. And I would put it at 24. Back to the Bachman books again for 23 with Rage. Now, I know this is a very controversial story because of its connections with the school shooting, and I wanted to read it to see like what all the hype was about it, like if it was really as bad as people said. Now, actually, considering it was the first thing Stephen King ever wrote, it actually is incredible. Like to see a high school, like he was near the end of high school when he wrote this. Like it's incredible to think that a high schooler had so much talent to write something like it. And the fact that it's written from a high school's point of view, it does sound childish a bit, but that works for it. It works because of the concept of the story. And I mean, some of the moments in the story, like where he gets shot and the bullet pierces his lock and blocks it, and especially the ending when everybody goes crazy on the one kid and then him and the other kid end up in like mental institutions. I actually love those part of the stories. I mean, always people focus on the fact that it revolves around a school shooting, but that's not what it's about. Originally, Stephen King wanted to call the story Getting It On, and that is what the story is about. Throughout the story, several people are repeating references to wanting to get it on. He's saying, yeah, let's get it on. The night I got it on, it was good. Things like that, right? But near halfway through the story, one of the girls repeats, I want to get it on too. So the whole point is they're sharing the experiences of their life and why they are outcast in this school. And eventually they realize that it's because of the popular people and the authorities above them that they are the downtrodden folks of the high school system. They are the unpopular cliques that exist among their classes. And it's because of people like the kid they attack in the end that caused it. So really, it wasn't focused so much on a school shooting or upraising of anarchy and rebellion. It was more so focusing on where the problems that create these, isolated groups in high school to make them like revolt against society and act the way they do, even uprising in some cases, as this, is because of the popularity controlling everything. Everything is a popularity contest, and that's what this book, this story, Rage, is really trying to say. I think Getting It On would have been a better title than Rage because then maybe people would have understood what he was really trying to go for. Overall, I actually love the story. I know it's controversial, and I'll put it this way. I don't think it would be a good story to read if you're still in high school. Probably wait until you're older, more mature to actually read it because you might not get it. You might just be caught up in the moment of what the vehicle he's using is to deliver this message instead of what the message is. But overall, I like Rage. So, yeah, 23. Probably a surprise to some people, but I dig it. Number 22, Skeleton Crew. Now, with this one, I actually really love a lot of the stories in this. Like, some of the stories in this are some of the best short stories he's ever written. But then there's a lot of others that are really just kind of chunky and weigh it down. Like, there's some stories I admit that outweigh Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which you could already tell I love because of how much I talked about it. But overall, um, there is some that weigh it down, which is why I don't think it's his best short story collection or even his second best, but I do think it is the third because it has stories like the iconic The Mist. Really love that one. Here There Be Tigers, I liked. The Monkey was one of my favorites. I will never look at those damn monkeys with the clanging cymbals ever again because those things are fucking scary. And that story makes it even scarier. Kane Rose Up. I actually think like it could tie in possibly to Rage. reading that story, it made me think of Rage. It's similar, and it seems like it could have taken place in the same universe. I think Rage is better. And then Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, I like that one. The Jaunt was probably my favorite story in this. The Wedding Gig was pretty good. Paranoid a Chant was weird. The Raft was good. Word Processor of the Gods. The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands. I love the return to the club from the breathing method. That was great. Um, Beach World was weird. I love the Reaper's Image, considering it was one of the first short stories he ever wrote. Nona was weird, but I liked it for some reason. Uncle Otto's Truck was maybe not one of my favorites, and then Morning Deliveries and Big Wheels, that kind of weighed it down for me. Grandma was pretty freaky. And then the Ballad of the Flexible Bullet was a weird one. The Reach, I don't know. The Reach gave me Dolores Claiborne vibes. But overall, like I said, some of these were like just fantastic. Like the Monkey, the Raft, the Jaunt, the Mist. Those stories fantastic. So, yeah, overall that's why it falls in at 22 for me, but definitely a good book and worth reading even for the Jaunt, the Monkey, and the Mist, if nothing else. One, we got Thinner. Now, this is another Richard Bachman book. This is one that actually was the last one before he was ousted as being Stephen King. Now, I saw the movie before reading this, so I do feel like I kind of knew what to expect, and maybe that hindered the experience until I got about two-thirds into the book. When it starts getting into Richie's story, the way it gets so much more intensely into description. Oh man, that's why this climbed. Like this might have actually been less enjoyable to me than The Running Man consistently, but near the end, the way it picks up with the twist and everything leading back to the gypsies and how Richie handles his business. Oh man, it's just fantastic because it makes the slow buildup of him losing the weight even more intense by that point because as he's losing the weight, it didn't really hit me until he got to a point where he was about 130 pounds. And then that scared the hell out of me because I'm only 120. And he had already lost almost 100 pounds at that point to even get to that weight. So for me, that was freaky. I'm like, if I had gotten his gypsy curse, I would have been like 30 pounds. I would have been dead, right? It would have been impossible to live with that kind of weight. So that freaked me out reading it because I'm naturally a pretty skinny guy to begin with, whereas this guy was big, right? But yeah, the way Richie is handling the business and dealing with the gypsies and getting the answers and resolving things, that is just so wonderfully executed that like it's scary, it's intense, but it's also like pretty suspenseful and action packed, and that's what makes this good. There is horror in it, and the horror is pretty unique and creepy, but the action. And that's why I say, like, that's where Bachman stories are always the best, is when they rely on the story and when they rely on the actions of the idea versus the character development. And that's why the characters aren't really the greatest, although Richie, that's why this is the second highest Bachman book for me. Richie is, well, actually, third highest. Richie is definitely the reason for that because he is probably one of the best characters that Stephen King has ever come up with as far as Richard Bachman novels. Like Richie is a gem because he is a very convincing mobster and he really is a guy you would not want to get on his bad side, but you would love to have him as a friend because he would handle his business and he would have your back. So, yeah, for me, that's where Thinner falls, 21. Number 20, we have Carrie, which I actually love this book more than I thought I would. It's very short. I read it in one day, and I really liked the story because it's short and it gets to the point, but it really is some beautiful character development. This is where we really get to see like Stephen King's strengths starting to emerge. He's figuring himself out as a writer more. He's got a clear, concise, focused voice. I do find that like the newspaper articles do kind of add a cool dimension to the story, although I do think they're slightly overused, which does weigh it down a bit. But overall, I have great empathy for Carrie's story and the way the suspense builds right to prom night and then just descends into complete chaos and goes crazy. This book had me like, oh God. In fact, the movie is good, and I've never fully seen the movie, but I've seen enough of it in bits and pieces to know how the story goes. There are some differences. I actually find that the book is a lot darker, and that's kind of what makes it better. But overall, I do really love this book because it's science fiction, it's horror, and yet it is a beautifully sad story of a girl's struggle just trying to fit in. And she's figuring herself out like growing up as a woman, and she's got to deal with her crazy mom, which, oh man, you would not want to have such a crazy parent in charge of your life, I'll tell you that. And as time goes on, you really see that even though they look at her like she's the bad one, she's the weird one, you start to really see that it's actually everybody else that are the ugly and the evil ones. That by the end, when the story is descending into its chaos, you're kind of happy for everybody getting what's coming to them because they brought it on themselves. They were so unfairly cruel to her that they deserve it. And you're kind of rooting for her, even though she's destroying the town and killing everybody. And that, to get the audience even in that state of mind, like you go, Carrie, that's what makes it a powerful book. And especially considering it was his first published book, Harry is definitely a masterpiece. At least in my opinion, I actually feel like right from the beginning you could tell this guy was a great writer. So here we go. And that's why it falls in at number 20. At number 19, we have The Green Mile, which is a fantastic book and one that I would definitely recommend people who aren't really into horror but want a good Stephen King book. Now, at the same time, there is some dark and twisted and kind of scary stuff in this, and also it's very heartbreaking. In fact, the movie is a fantastic adaptation of this, but I find that the book actually goes more in depth with the dark and heartbreaking side of the story. For example, in the movie, we don't find out how Mr. Jangles died, which is very tragic. We don't find out how all the other guards died, and we don't find out how Paul Edgecomb's wife died. Whereas in the book, it tells you that, and those are some of the most heartbreaking things ever just because of everything that like Tom Hanks' character Paul Edgecombs has already gone through dealing with John Coffey, um being the, guard he was at Cold Mountain Penitentiary, and then of course you think about all the stuff he went through, like executing the prisoners, the bladder infection, and he goes on and he doesn't know how long he's going to go on because eventually you realize he's telling his friend this story as an old man several years after it, and he's really old. Mr. Jangles is really old. Mr. Jangles finally dies, but it makes him wonder how much longer he's got. And he wonders, is he cursed because he let John Coffey die? Is that why he's going on? And he also believes it even more because of what happened to his wife and all the other prison guards. So yeah, beautiful, heartbreaking book. Just a fantastic book as a whole. Never mind Stephen King's work. So it falls in at 19 because there are 18 other books I prefer to it, but still a classic. Two thumbs up, you know? So, yeah, 19, Green Mile. For 18, we have the last of the Bachman books, The Long Walk. Now, it isn't the last of the books he wrote as Richard Bachman because there is one that is higher up on this list, and it was actually the last one he wrote, other than Blaze, which I haven't read yet, and that came out years after he was exposed. Like as a trunk novel, he had worked on as Bachman, but never completed until then. But yeah, The Long Walk was actually the second book that Stephen King ever officially wrote. Even before Carrie got published, he wrote The Long Walk, and it is amazing. It is a great story because you could really see in this story he was building the strength of developing characters. There is a lot of great characters in this. The concept is really cool, and that's why I say overall, out of all of Richard Bachman's books, I think that this was the best designed story. But also, I think part of that is because he wrote it right after he'd finished high school pretty much, and he had developed his craft enough by then, but he was still in the early stages where even when it was published as Richard Bachman, he was writing it as Stephen King. And this is a fantastic Stephen King story, which is why it is the second best Bachman book, in my opinion. Now, the reason I put one other above it, I will explain later. But overall, this story is so cool. And the way he throws the abstract ending that makes you wonder what the fate of the main character really is by the end of the story. That is haunting, scary, and one of the best cliffhangers he's ever like put into a story just because it's such a long journey to even get to that point that when you get there you just feel like you're going to be forever wandering this journey with him wondering what happened to him. So yeah, great haunting story. I love The Long Walk. So that's why it falls in at number 18. Next we have number 17, The Stand. Fantastic book. Definitely worth reading once in your lifetime. It is a chunky one, though. It is long. It took me over 10 days, I think 11 or 12 to finish this, but it was a beautiful book. And I mean, the original miniseries, I don't really like the remake. I don't like remakes in general, but the original miniseries did it just. But the book had a little more of what I wanted out of the story. So I do actually think the book itself is worth reading, especially if you like the miniseries. But it is long, so it wouldn't be something you'd constantly want to reread just because it's chunky. But it really is a beautiful story because just the character developments. He has some of the best characters he has ever written in his entire career in this story, and it's beautiful. Now, the beginning is absolutely terrifying. It does kind of drag on near the middle, and a lot of people talk about that, and I agree. But the climatic ending, and I mean, just the almost melancholic and sort of mundane ending I really actually loved just because I feel like it really reflects how real life is in that regard. And the scenes with Stu and Tom, especially near the ending, are beautiful. Like when he's putting on the movie on the projector for him and all the other stuff. I thought those were some of the best like parts of the whole book because they were touching. I also like Jana Durkin's part. Dana Durkins, I believe her name is. Sorry, I might be mispronouncing it. But her story was really good, and then I also really liked Lloyd's story. And Nick. Nick is probably my favorite character. So yeah, just overall, all the characters were pretty good. The only character I didn't like that kind of weighed it down a bit and quite a bit was Franny. Now, she's one of the main female characters. I did not care for her character. I feel like 90% of the problems in this book were caused by her character. The other 10% were caused by Randall Flagg, the government, and Nadine, but 90%. Franny. And at the same time, I do appreciate her character development that she becomes more tolerable because I would have really hated this book even more if she just stayed the same self-centered bitch that she is in the beginning. Thank God she changed and became better. But yeah, overall, that's where it sits for me, number 17. And definitely still a classic. Next, we have Needful Things at number 16. Now, this is a great book. I saw the movie before I read the book. But what was great was by the time I had read the book, I had read three out of the four original Castle Rock stories, and I read the Sundog, which is a prequel. So I really got the full experience of all the characters reflected from the other stories. I mean, we got references to Cujo, the Dark Half, the Dead Zone, and of course, the Sundog, and yeah, it all ties together. It all comes here. And what is great is if you've read those stories, you can reflect on them. And even though I hadn't read Cujo at that point, I understood the story enough that I could still follow along with the Cujo references. But yeah, the book has everything that the movie has, but in a more wild, like dark comedy style. And I really love that about this book. Like it makes it a classic because of all the crazy other elements that like are outside of the main story. Like the subplots are solid gold. Like Ace Merrill from The Body, his side story where he's working for Leland Gaunt is so freaking entertaining and hilarious that it could have been its own book. And that's what I mean. To just have that as a side story, a subplot in this thing. It makes it a masterpiece. Like all the interconnected stories. A lot of people think it's hard to follow. There's a lot of stories, but everything all comes apart in the end anyway. But seeing everybody going to that direction and like arriving there all at different points and all kind of getting taken care of by Gaunt and him masterminding this deal where he's pretty much getting the town to sell their souls to like for what they want and like the way everybody is going at each other's throats by the end, it is intense. I mean, I love the story too because the characters are all so good and it's such a simple scenario, but it works because of our familiarity with the characters. It makes it comfortable that even the more simplest of a plot could be quite terrifying when it's characters that we've invested so much like time and emotion and effort into because of the previous books. That's what makes this a masterpiece. In my opinion, if you read the other Castle Rock stories before this book, much better. It makes the experience better. In fact, I wish I had read Cujo before that. But even though I didn't, because I read the other ones, I was familiar enough that it really made this a way better book. Whereas if I didn't know the characters as much, it wouldn't have been as emotionally impactful in the end result. So definitely I would say like read The Dead Zone, read The Body, read Cujo, and read The Dark Half because there's a lot of George Stark and Thad Beaumont references. There's also a returning character, Sheriff Alan Pangborn, who replaced Sheriff George Bannerman, who was in the Dead Zone and Cujo. He was killed in Cujo. And see, that was heartbreaking when I read that because I didn't read that, but I knew he was dead. And I was like, oh, man, that's horrible. But yeah, definitely read those stories first just because it makes this book better. But yeah, number 16, we're at the halfway point. This is like sitting right above it. So that's got to tell you, it's pretty damn good. Number 15, we have Night Shift, which is second best story collection for me. Everybody has different opinions, and I get like this is his first short story collection. I do see why a lot of people would say it's his best. However, I like the stories in the one coming up. Don't want to give away spoilers yet. I like that one more just because of some of the stories in it. Like I really just love the atmosphere and the vibe of those stories. However, I could honestly say there isn't a bad story in this one, and I love them all. Like first we have Jerusalem's Law, a little prequel to Salem's Lot that I really like. And then I like Graveyard Shift is pretty entertaining. Short story with the rats is pretty dark, scary, it's gross. It's creepy. Night Surf, I like the tie-in to the stand. I thought was cool. I Am the Doorway was wild. The Mangler was actually a great story because I never thought like a laundry pressing machine could be scary. Like it's such a goofy story and yet it's scary enough that somehow it works. I heard the movie is bogus and it sucks and it's not good at all. But what I could say about the short story is it manages to actually make this laundry pressing machine like terrifying for the fact that it's like possessed by some sort of weird demon and yeah, it's scary. Like it's surprisingly scary because you wouldn't think it would be with such a cheesy and corny idea, and yet he executes it perfectly, which is why it climbs as high as it does. Like because of genius like that. The Boogeyman, great short story. Actually, the twist at the end, oh my God, that made me jump because I really didn't see that coming. Gray Matter was a weird story. I liked it though, as weird as it was. Battleground was cool. That gave me like a weird Richard Bachman kind of vibe too. Crux, I actually thought was way better as a short story than the movie Maximum Overdrive that it was based on. Sometimes they come back. The movie for that was pretty good, but the short story, way darker. They could not have put that into a made for TV movie, which is why they made all the changes. But oh my God, it is way scarier in the short story, way darker too. And then Strawberry Spring, that's about a serial killer. That wasn't a bad story. It gave me another sort of mystery Richard Bachman vibe to it, but I didn't mind it. The Ledge, that was scary because I don't like looking down. Like heights are not a big thing for me, so that scared the hell out of me. The Lawnmower Man was weird as hell, but very entertaining at the same time. Quitters Inc., which is about like a company that helps people quit smoking, scary as hell as a smoker. Probably one of the scariest things he's ever written. Like if you're a smoker, this story will scare the hell out of you. And then I Know What You Need. Probably my favorite, if not my favorite, yeah, definitely one of my favorites. Like probably second favorite. Because of the whole voodoo vibe to the story, I love it. It's creative and it just manages to be tame enough that it works because if it was any weirder, it'd be kind of out there, but it's just the right balance. Children of the Corn. I've never seen the movie. The short story's pretty good though. The Last Rung on the Ladder. That's kind of more of a serious story. The Man Who Loved Flowers. That's an entertaining one. It's weird. And then One for the Road, my favorite, is like a prequel of what's happening in Salem's Lot after all that stuff happened in the novel. And then The Woman in the Room is kind of a more like sad, sorrow-filled melodrama sort of story, but overall really beautifully written. And that's why I say like every story in this is actually good. Now, some I love way more than others, but overall, none of them are bad. And that's why, for me, falls in at number 15, our halfway. Number 14, we have The Dark Half, which is an incredible story because its premise is a little strange and bizarre. But when you actually realize that he was translating his experiences as an author, battling his own addictions and writing under his own pseudonym, being an influence to this. That's kind of what makes this book such a masterpiece. I mean, it is the third of the Castle Rock stories, which it was actually the first one I read and I loved it. It was the fourth book I read too of all his. And it did fall a bit overall just because I've read so many other books along the way that beat it. But overall, I still love this book and I'm glad I read it because it gave me such an understanding of why he writes as Stephen King and why it's different when he writes as Richard Bachman. In fact, this was actually intended to be a collaboration book between Stephen King and Richard Bachman originally. And you can feel that because he uses parts of a manuscript he was starting to write before he got ousted as Richard Bachman in the story under George Stark's character as Thad Beaumont's pseudonym. And the way he battles his pseudonym in the story is almost reflective to how Stephen King battled against his addictions. There's a lot of real insight from the author's life in this story, and that's what makes it beautiful. And the cool thing about it is, too, the way the writer in the story got ousted is very similar to how Stephen King himself got ousted as Richard Bachman. So that's why I love this book. The whole Sparrows thing. George Starks is a terrifying villain. Probably one of the scariest villains he's ever come up with, and not a very nice guy, as his tombstone would say. Now, overall, the reason this is still 14 is because this is a book that I just really feel everything that Stephen King does to be a good author is present in this book. And for the fourth book I read, it's still one of my favorites. I mean, we're now in the halfway downward part, so everything I'm going to start talking about from here on in is going to be stuff like I absolutely love. Like, we're over the halfway hump, so everything here is stuff I love. Now, if something is higher or lower than the next book, it just means that, in my personal opinion, I loved that one. Probably just a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on which book you're looking at. Now, with this one, I loved it as soon as I read it. But in that time, there were still 13 overall books I liked more. Number 13 is Joyland, one of his hard case crime stories, and it's got a bit of a supernatural twist. I really love the characters. The story to this one is beautiful, and I actually find that this is one that, because it's a newer book, it's very underrated. Like, in my personal opinion, this is a book I could suggest to anybody. Like, you want a great newer Stephen King book, this is a fantastic one. It's not too long. I read it in one day and I loved it. Like, I couldn't put it down. The mystery had me intrigued. The little light sprinkles of supernatural twist worked well with the story. And then the beautiful story of heartbreak and finding new love and all these other things that were going on in the book, it just made it a really well-rounded story. Like, this is like, I will never forget how good this story really was because I didn't really know what to expect. There is no movie for it. I never read it before. I'd heard people talk about it, but I didn't know? And knowing that it wasn't overly scary right from the start, I didn't really wonder if it was going to hit every sort of thing I want good about a Stephen King book. And in that sense, it actually surprised me. Like, there were parts that were so dark that I didn't see coming in this story that the whole time it felt like I was in the story trying to solve the mystery with the characters. That by the time the who done it got revealed, I couldn't even believe it myself because the whole time I was sitting there as I'm reading it, sort of taking guesses like, oh, it's probably this guy. No, no, it can't be this guy. It might be this guy though. Yeah, yeah, it's probably this guy. And then wait, what? It's this guy? No, it can't be this guy. Like, wow, like why was it this guy? Like, and then when you find out everything about why it is, I mean, it's just great. And then the whole reference to Frank Dodd's character from the Dead Zone, I really loved how he stealthily threw that in there. Not obvious enough that you would get it right away, but just slightly enough that I picked up on it and was like, hey, wait a second there. But yeah, the way the supernatural elements tie up the other ends of the mystery wrap it up like a bow, and it is just a fantastic book. Like, I would definitely say, like, Joyland is one I would recommend to anybody. Like, if you just want a good story from Stephen King, not overly scary and not crazy long, this is a fantastic choice. So, yeah, for me, that's why it falls in at number 13. Number 12 is Cujo. Now, this was a fantastic book to read. I read it in 3 days, 100 pages or so a day. And what I really loved about this book is it gave a lot more insight that we didn't get with the movie. And especially because it's the second Castle Rock book. It's literary in its sense of how it's structured. Like, there's no chapters, you're really just getting a continuous narrative, but it is really gripping and impactful. And it's such a dark story. And the way you see the transition from the good Cujo in the beginning of the story to how he turns into this rabid monster that's a beast, is just killing everybody in his path. And then he is the reason that the great Sheriff Bannerman from the Dead Zone dies. And that's why Alan Pangborn from the Dark Half and Needful Things takes over. Is because if George Bannerman didn't sacrifice his life, then the lady would have died in the car and she couldn't have got out. The son, he died, whereas that was different than the movie, and that made it a lot more dark. And her and her husband just never really recovered from that, it seems. And it's a really sad, dark story, but it is scary. And I'll put it this way: some people complained about a very claustrophobic, one-dimensional setting to it, but I actually think that when you're reading it, it's a lot more scary to hear about it because you understand that the characters want to make a break for it. They're thinking about it. And the one time she tries, she gets bitten and injured and ends up getting rabies. So, just overall, it's a really scary, sad, dark novel. And that's why I say this was the last Castle Rock one that I read. And I wish I had read it sooner, but I knew enough about the story that when the time came, it didn't spoil any of the other ones. And because I had read The Dead Zone prior to this, that was the missing piece for this one. Because The Dead Zone was essentially the second one I read of the Castle Rock stories, that one laid the foundation for why it's so tragic when the sheriff, bites the bullet and gets killed by Cujo. Overall, I really love this one, and that's why for me it falls in at number 12. And that's pretty good because it's just shy 2 spots from the top 10, right? So, and of course, we're about to get into our top 10 after one more, and the next one is 11. Number 11, we have The Dead Zone. Fantastic book. The first of the main Castle Rock stories. And I really love this one because the movie is great. And the movie is another one of those fantastic adaptations. But the book just had so much more meat on the bone, you could say, to the story. And the story is a beautiful one because even though it's not the most scary story, which is probably why it's right outside the top 10, I didn't really find this one to have too much horror, but the real life horror still kind of lingers in a suspenseful atmosphere throughout the book. Now, the romance is beautiful, the psychic aspects of the story are great, the introduction of Sheriff George Bannerman is great. Johnny is a wonderful character, and we even get to see Miguel Ferrer's character from the Night Flyer, Richard D's first appearance in the Dead Zone. So that's why I really love the book even more than the movie because of that little bit of the story we never got in the movie. And then you also take into consideration that ended a lot more ominous and mysterious than the movie did. The movie was very cut and to the point, whereas this was a lot more open for interpretation. And then I also really love um how even though it is like a decently long book, by the time you finish reading it, it feels like it went by so fast, and you're almost sad as you get to the end because you enjoy the story so much that it goes by before you know it and it's over. And this is one of those books that I really felt that way reading it. Like by the end, I was sad that I was done. I didn't want to stop reading it, but we were at the end of the story because it's just overall such a beautiful story. And that's why, like, some people have even cited that it's their favorite, and I get it. Not my favorite, but overall, it's one book I couldn't even say anything bad about. And that's why it rounds off at number 11. Number 10, we have Misery. Fantastic book. And honestly, I'd seen the movie long, long ago, but the book is way more dark and gruesome than the movie. Like, the movie is great. So just imagine if the gore was upped a little bit more and there was a lot more intense, nursing and operational practices involved in the story, and you will get a picture of why this book is so much more intense than the movie could be. It just would have been too disturbing to make it as graphic as the book, as you could tell from the axe, instead of using a paddle to break the guy's legs like in the movie. Now, what I also love about this story, and a lot of people criticize this part of it, but some people, they either like it or they don't, but people complain about how there is Paul Sheldon writing misery in misery, and he's writing a book about this character while he's going through this. However, what makes that part of the book so good is when you realize how much he's struggling trying to write such a good story. Like, the story is all right and it's not bad, but when you think about all the stress, all the emotional trauma he's been through, and what he's forced to do to create this story, all the things that he goes through along creating it, amputation, uh when the typewriter starts breaking and he's got to start filling in all the letters like N's, T's, E's, it's just, it gets so intense that, like, you feel so much sorrow for this guy as a writer, even having to come up with a story under such difficult stress, and he manages to. And then all the other horror, how crazy Annie is, and especially, like, they don't tell you what fully became of her fate in the movie, but the book does, and oh my God, it's even more disturbing than the movie, I'll tell you that. That's why this book shocked me with how horrifying it is. It's really freaking scary, and it's a great story. He just put so much into this book that that's why it had to fall in at number 10, because this book is just a masterpiece of horror. It really is. At number 9, we have Different Seasons. Four novellas, all so good. I mean, I knew Shawshank Redemption and the story is good. I actually think the movie did a better job of the story. It took everything from the story, but added a few details that kind of polished it off and made it even better. But still a great story. Reading it, I couldn't help but imagine Morgan Freeman narrating it the whole time. And then the second story, shocking and dark, apt pupil. Oh my God, one of the most. I'll put it this way: it was so tense for me reading that story. I was up till 2 in the morning just trying to wait for a part for the story's tension to die down because I felt like I couldn't go to sleep after being left with such intense graphic imagery. Like, that story horrified me because it was realistic, but it was dark. And then, yeah, of course, the body is really great. They made it into Stand By Me. The story is a bit darker, which I actually kind of like looking back. I felt like it ties off the loose ends a little better the way Stephen King did it. But for a more positive, optimistic ending, the movie kind of worked with that better. But yeah, overall, like that was a great story. And then the last one, the breathing method was my favorite out of every story in this. It was just amazing. And it was such a beautiful story. It was horrifying, it was emotional, it was mysterious. Like that story in itself is what made this just climb so high up in my list because the breathing method, it could have been its own book and I would have loved it and it might have even placed higher. But overall, it pushes this into the top 10 because it's one of the best things he ever wrote. Period. The breathing method. Apt pupil, great. Shawshank Redemption. Well, Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank Redemption is the short story is called. Fantastic. And of course, the body, you can't beat it because they made it into Stand By Me. So all four are so good. And all I could say is there just happens to be eight more that I like better than it. But this is just, we're in excellent territory to say the least. Number eight, we have Bag of Bones, which is absolutely incredible. And I really feel like it's an underrated one that a lot of people just didn't get and understand. But this is one I loved right as soon as I started reading it. And I could see why in the middle it kind of does drag down a bit, which is probably a big part of why people don't put this higher generally, but not enough to kill the story. And I actually find that, like, Mike as a character is one of the best like prototypes of like writer Stephen King characters that he's ever put into a novel. And all the different tie-ins to the past, the scene where he's swimming and he's getting rocks pelted at him so he can't go to the shore. I mean, that was horrifying. And like I'll put it this way, as I'm reading it, I was on the edge of my seat and then after I was kind of like, what the hell did I just read? Like that really just happened? That was wild. And like overall, this book is just so good because it doesn't need horror throughout it. It has such a great story, even without the horror elements. It's beautifully written. I mean, the relationship between Mike and Kyra or Kira, I'm not sure how you'd say it, is so beautiful that in itself is why it ranks so high with me. And then the way he sprinkles the little dashes of horror throughout it is like you really don't know when it's going to hit you. So when it does hit you, it's so much more impactful because you don't see it coming. Like there's times where it's a very peaceful, easygoing, beautiful story, and then you'll just find out another turn of events that like kind of ties up the story in a knot that makes it so much more darker than you realized it was prior. And there's so much mystery to the story too that I really find that he delivers such a solid book with this one. It is underrated because it has a lot of Stephen King's strengths as a writer at some of their highest points throughout this book. And that's why, me personally, I love it. And it comes in at number eight. And as soon as I started reading it, I knew I was going to love it. And even though, like, I wasn't sure where it was going to fall into my list, I kind of knew it was going to make it into the top 10. Now, for a while, I actually thought it might have made it into the top five, but like I said, I do kind of see why people don't like the like middle part where it kind of drags down a bit, but at the same time, the overall story is so good that it still keeps itself afloat. And I just love it because it really is a wild, crazy book, but it's also a very beautiful story. So yeah, Bag of Bones falls in at number eight. Number seven, we have Just After Sunset, my favorite collection of short stories. And overall, I really love this book because It was just such an enjoyable experience reading it, and I really didn't know what to expect, especially because this came later on in Stephen King's career. As a matter of fact, this was published, let's see here, in 2008. So, yeah, this is a later one, and yet it is absolutely fantastic. The opening story, Willa, is haunting. Love that opening ghost story. The atmosphere of every story really reflects the cover, and it's just so beautiful in that sense. And that opening story paints that picture right from the start. The Gingerbread Girl, one of my favorite short stories Stephen King has ever written. Just so good. Harvey's Dream wasn't bad, pretty good, but there were other stories that were just way better, right? Rest Stop, I really love the Bachman vibes of that story. That one's a good one. Stationary Bike was wild, and yet it worked because, as weird as it is, you're just compelled to read it to the end to see where exactly it's going. And it's like being on the stationary bike because you're getting all the answers right away, and yet it's still shrouded in so much mystery. The Things They Left Behind is a nice take on sort of the after effects of 9/11. I thought was kind of cool. Graduation Afternoon was cool because it's like this post-apocalyptic story. And then N, this really Lovecraftian weird story. I loved N. N was wild, and like I could see people not liking N because it's so weird, and yet it works because that is the whole point of it, and it just charms its way to be this like really just straight up impossible to forget kind of story. And then next we have The Cat from Hell, which was one that he wrote a long time ago that finally made it into print with this one, because I guess there was a contest where readers could decide the ending to it, and he had written his own ending in case they didn't do that concept. So that one with the ending never got published, but that basically is his original version of the story. And then the New York Times says Special Bargain Rates is a really good one because it's all about like um this woman who's lost her husband, and she gets a call telling her about things that are going to happen in the future from her husband who died. And then every time that phone rings afterwards, he warns her that something will happen, but she never gets to pick up the phone in time again when he tries to rewarn her that it's happening now. And then Mute was a wild story because, like, I'll put it this way, like it's a mystery story, but then you kind of expect the ending and yet you don't. And that's why it's actually really good. Ayana wasn't bad. But the next story, A Very Tight Place, it's nasty, and yet it is such a good story because it's a perfect example of how Stephen King's mind works. Like he'll see something, he'll get an idea, and he'll just run with it. And that's why I say, like this one I could give so much praise because I just really love all the stories in this to some extent, and the ones that I might not like that much, they're made up for by the ones I just absolutely love. So, yeah, Just After Sunset falls in at number seven. Number six, the highest Bachman book, and one of the most underrated Stephen King novels ever, in my opinion. Like The Regulators, number six, so good. And of course, it's mostly known for being the companion novel of Desperation, which I also love. Part of why I love this one so much is the regulators tied in to the Desperation. But this on its own is such a fantastic and beautiful story, and it's such a cool, unique, out there, wild concept that he actually pulls off so beautifully. And you could tell it's the first time he was truly writing as Bachman other than Thinner, where it was planned to be Bachman but hint that it was Stephen King. And that with this, he was just straight up approaching it from the style he had developed in the Bachman books. And it's Bachman in his most concentrated form, I find. And it is a masterpiece because it is a crazy story, but because if you read Desperation, you get attached a bit to the characters. When you come back to them in the regulators and their fates play out way differently in this like completely alternate universe version of the story from Desperation, it really moved me to love the story more because I love Desperation, which is why it's higher on the list. But because of that, I loved the regulators even more. Like, in a way, I would say it's difficult to say that I like the regulators completely more or less than Desperation or vice versa, because really the combination of the two amplifies both stories, like, because of the connection with the characters. This one, what I really loved that it did differently, Desperation I found was scarier, whereas this one was a lot more cartoonish. But what really made the story beautiful was the interactions between the characters, especially the autistic boy Seth. His story is really moving and it's so sad because it shows you too in society we often underestimate characters or people with disabilities because from what Seth has with his autism and then being possessed by Tack, you wouldn't expect a boy like that, who's that young, to understand that he has to accept his own demise in order to stop this evil demon from destroying everybody. That they've been pulled into another dimension, which is drawing energy from his imagination. And this is such a complex, like, concept to understand, and yet Seth becomes aware of it and willingly participates to save everybody in the neighborhood from what Tack has conjured up. And that's why, like, just overall, it's such a beautiful story that I feel like so many people overlook how good of a story it is. As crazy as its ideas are, the story itself with the characters is actually such a remarkable and beautiful piece of literature. So, yeah, that's why it falls in just shy of the top five at number six. Number five, Dolores Claiborne. So, with this one, so good. I mean, we are in the top five now, and it is one of those books that is so good. I would recommend to anybody, especially people who don't like horror, because there are slight hinges of horror, which when you appreciate them as the full like painting of the story, every painting needs at least some dark colors to contrast with brighter ones, and it has that. It has the horror, it has the suspense, it has the intensity, but it also has humor. It also has a beautiful depiction of country life out on like isolated island off the coast of Maine with that authentic dialect so you could feel it. Like it is one narrative, and yet it is such a beautiful story. You can't help wanting to hear how it's all going to turn out as soon as you start reading it. I mean, this is over 300 pages, and I read this in one day. Stayed up till after 3 in the morning because this book was just so good couldn't stop. Like I had to hear the rest of this story. Like I couldn't like if I was to put it down and try to do something else, I remembered that day because it would last like a minute and I would be like, okay, you know what? No, 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 I have to figure out where is this going? Like because the mysteries of the story are so compelling that with how the rest of the story is playing out, it's so beautiful. You can't help but like kind of put the mystery on the back burner because you just want to hear the beauty of this wild rural story. But the whole time you're like, okay, but I do want to know. I want to know, like, what happened? What is this Dolores woman talking about? She says she killed her husband, and then she's saying she didn't kill this woman. So you want to hear, okay, she's pretty ballsy to just straight up say that, and then she's later admitting nobody knew or convicted her of it, but that is what happened. But it's in her own defense to say, like, look, I did this, I'll give you that, but I did not do this, so don't pin me for that. And the way she presents the narrative, you think, wow, like, okay, she's gonna just tell us the straight story, like, not holding back, and she does. And by the end of it, you really sympathize with her for everything she went through. And at the same time, you believe her when she says she didn't kill the woman because she explains why it looked like she killed the older woman that she worked for because she inherited the money and everything. But she's explaining she almost did because the woman wanted to. But at the same time, she didn't because the woman died from falling down the stairs beforehand, which was an accident. So, because of that, like you really believe her, and so does the law enforcement, and they've been recording this whole story, and now they finally also have the closure for the mystery of her husband's death all those years prior, which is why she finally comes to light because the town, they're onto her. They suspect her. Two murders or deaths happen around her that are mysterious, and she has no connection. No, they're all on to her. And because of that, the pressure, it builds and builds. And finally, she just needs to tell her story. And it is just a masterpiece of a story, which is why Dolores Claiborne falls in at number 5. Number 4, we have The Shining. Absolute masterpiece, and one of only two books in this collection that I've actually read twice. Now, rereading it the second time, I actually loved it more. I loved it so much that I read it in 3 days. Like, it was just so good like the first time I read it. And then I saw the movie and I thought the movie doesn't even compare to how good the book is. Like the book is so more deep with the details about the characters like Jack and Danny and Wendy and the Overlook Hotel's history and all that. This is just such a good story because like it's great as a ghost story. It's great as just an emotional story of isolation out in the middle of nowhere. There's so many things that make this such a masterpiece of his writing. And like it's one of those books that like I feel like it cements him as one of the best writers of our time because with The Shining, like it's even as the description in the back says, like this chilling novel will haunt you and make your blood run cold and your heart race with fear, guaranteed to frighten you into fits, freezing terror with a climax that is literally explosive. And you know what? That is one, those are two reviews I 100% agree with. Like, I will not even say, oh, they're exaggerating. No, those are perfectly spot on. This book, I remember the first time I read it, I felt isolated and it was scary. And then reading it a second time, I didn't even feel as isolated, but because I was older, I could kind of understand like the more adult themes going on in the story better. I could tell that like there was a darkness that was never seen before. And I'll put it this way. There were parts like I had forgot about that when I went back and reread them, they scared me even more. Like I'd never noticed like it actually mentioned out near where the playground was. Instead of the twins from the movie saying, "Come and play with us, Danny, forever and ever," it's a hand that reaches out of this snowbank and calls to Danny and tells him, "Come play," like deep buried in the snowbank and he ends up running from the hedge animals down where it is and he could hear it like with him and he can feel its cold presence among them and he's like trying to get away and he's scared the snow will fall in on him and like seal him in like I forgot about that. I was like, oh my God, man, that is even more terrifying than anything we saw in the movie. And like, that's why I say this as a book, it has to get in the top 5 for me because this has everything that makes a Stephen King book great. Like horror, wonderful characters, a great story, and probably his most suspenseful book, which is why it's so good. Overall, the tension is just building and building and building throughout this whole thing to the point it becomes like the boiler and just explodes by the end. And it's timeless. It's a masterpiece. So yeah, The Shining, number four. Guys, here, number three, Desperation. And oh man, this book, it's so good. I will even read some reviews, and if they are accurate, I will tell you straight up. Like, okay, so a big, serious, scary novel. King is at the top of his game. Entertainment Weekly. And I would agree with that. This actually, in my opinion, is one of his most underrated but best books. It's my third favorite because it just overall, this was the book that made me want to read 30 Stephen King books and do this list. Like, this was the book that started it all. This book is so good. And it's such a rush reading it because it's just a great story. I mean, the description here. There's a place along Interstate 50 that some call the loneliest place on earth. It's known as Desperation, Nevada. It's not a very nice place to live. It's an even worse place to die. Let the battle against evil begin. Welcome to Desperation. I mean, right there, that says it all. And you know what? What I love about this is the sort of spiritual and like almost biblical commentary that goes on throughout the story that leads to the end with that almost unknown resolution of where God fits into everything, not only in the story, but it reflects to the readers like where is God in everything? Like, does he allow these cruel things to go on for some greater purpose? Like that is so real. It's like some people would want to believe in God, some people wouldn't want to believe in God, but I feel like that hits the nail right at the head no matter where you fall on that side of the domino because that right there says it all. We don't know. But if there was, what would we react to if that was the circumstance? And I mean, surreal, tragic, scary, builds to an epic climax, terror that resonates long after the book is finished. I 100% agree with that because even afterwards, I couldn't even, like, I'll put it this way. I didn't start Salem's Lot until a day or so after because I was just so shook up after reading this book for the first one that I was kind of like, okay, I need to just chill on that one for a bit because it's such a wild experience reading this book because, in my opinion, he actually has some of his best characters ever. Hence why I love the Regulator so much. Like a lot of the same characters come back in alternative ways. The funny thing is, I couldn't stand Audrey's character in Desperation, but I love her character in the Regulators. And that's kind of the funny irony that they're so different. Like in this one, she's terrible. Although I felt so bad when she meets her horrible fate. And I mean, John Marinville's arc as the writer, oh my God, he's a great character. Sheriff Intragian is good. Tack is this crazy, wild, otherworldly demon, earth demon being that's just great. David is entertaining, and like all the other characters, Mary, Steve, Cynthia, and then like you look at like how they are in the Regulators, a lot of them are different. Some die in the Regulators that live in Desperation and vice versa. So completely different stories. It's like part of the same universe split in two, and just one is going this way and the other is the polar opposite. So that's why they're so different, but they are great together. But this for me, I just felt like because of the spiritual concept of it, the horror is gruesome and graphic and it will shock you. And then like the characters, the story quality, and the atmosphere of the setting just really creates this awesome mood. So that's why, like, yeah, it falls in at number three for me because it would have to be my third favorite book out of all the ones I read so far. And ultimate number two Pet Cemetery. And this one I have read twice, and the second time scared me way more. I think because I was older, I've seen the movie, but even still, like, I love this book. As scary as it is, it's hard to read. Like, I know all these statements kind of sound contradictory. Like, I love it. It scared the hell out of me, and yet, like, it's hard to read because it's so powerful and moving. Like, it's one you really will kind of, it will sit in your head after, and you'll just think about it. And, like, the difference with this in the movie is this goes so much more intensely into, like, the spiritual and otherworldly elements of the story, and it makes it 100% more terrifying, like, because of that. And then also the fact that, like, when you're reading this, there isn't too many characters in the story, which it makes it more of an intimate relationship with the characters that there are. Even though you notice the flaws of all these different characters as you're going through this story, you become attached for their good qualities. You love them and you kind of want to see this story through with them, even though you know this is not going to end well. And it almost hints that it is not going to go well right at the beginning. Like with a title like this, you don't really know what you're getting. Like you think you're getting something, but like if you've never seen the movie or read the book, you wouldn't know quite what you're getting till you get into it. And it's like when you're getting into it, you can feel like something is going to be horribly wrong about this experience, but you want to see it through because right from the beginning, he gets you hooked into these characters, and then you want to see what happens with them and how things are going to turn out. And as things unfold, you realize, like, it's not even so much the characters you are around that have control over the situation, but it's the otherworldly forces that we don't see that are really in control of everything. And that, in a way, it's kind of like a polar opposite version of desperation, whereas it's God pulling the strings of everything. This is like the dark presence of the Wendigo and the cursed Micmac burial ground that are like moving everything in motion to its own dark, twisted will. And then the tragedy and the story of grief affecting somebody to make them go crazy, and like all the horror of this place where it's just been drenched with like tainted blood for hundreds of years is just it. I could understand why he was afraid to publish it, and it is probably his overall scariest book. Like, I would say it's even scarier than number one, but I just like number one more. But overall, that's why it falls in number two, because this is what really proves how good Stephen King is, how scary he can make it, but still deliver a compelling emotional emotion. Like a powerful, compelling emotion to really move us with the story through this journey to hell that we get with the Creed family. I mean, just for a quick example, like you even look at it like this, like the most frightening novel Stephen King has ever written. Wild, powerful, disturbing. A stunner. King gets you to believe the unbelievable. Unrelenting, convincing, awesome power is best yet. And you know what? I don't doubt those as statements. They are validly accurate, and I could see why it would be considered his best. I actually think, objectively, if you're really going for horror, if you want just his scariest, then yes, it would be number one. Whereas I like his story for the characters and the story quality of it, which is the only reason that it is beat by our next contender at number one. Number one, grand champ of the top 30, Salem's Law. Now, this one, has everything. Everything is perfect. All the stars aligned in the universe of this story, and that's why I love it. Now, a fun fact, this was Stephen King's take on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Dracula was actually one of the first books I read as a kid and became my favorite book for a long time. Even though it's got an odd structure to the novel, it really works, and I can see its influence in this. Now, why this makes it my favorite to out of all Stephen King books is not because of that, but it is kind of an interesting fact just to know. But it is a novel of chilling, unspeakable evil, a super exorcism, and tremendous spine-tingling fiction at its best, and I would agree with all those things. Stephen King's second novel, Salem's Lot, is the story of a mundane town under siege from the forces of darkness, considered one of the most terrifying vampire novels ever written. It cunningly probes the shadows of the human heart and the insular evils of small-town America. And yeah, like that says it all right there. I mean, I'll put it this way, from the first time I picked it up and read it, it was the second book I read right after Desperation. I knew it was my favorite because it just, there wasn't anything I could say I didn't like about it. Like, I'll put it this way, it has heartbreaking moments. It has really scary horror. It has great story quality. It has fantastic, memorable characters. Some that leave you on mysterious cliffhangers that I just love too, because I was like, oh, I love that they don't answer that, because now you could just think, oh, maybe they are out there still. Maybe even still to this day. And that's why, like, I love that he did that, and just that open, interpretable ending that is very ominous and off-putting because of the journey we go through with this story is just perfect. Like, I'll put it this way, when I first finished it, I was kind of frustrated by the ending. I'm like, but I want to know, like, what happened? Did they kill the vampires? Are any of them still alive? What happened to Father Callahan? But then the more it sat with me, the more I realized it's the whole point. Forever now, that world will just be opened and exist. It'll just linger. It's never been closed off. And that is what the genius of it was, is he did that so early in his career. You wouldn't have thought that he could bring elements from that world back into other stories, like he did with One for the Road and Jerusalem's Lot in Night Shift. I love that he did that. And then I've heard stories that he also included characters from The Dark Tower, like he brought characters from Salem's Lot into it. And like, to just hear that is awesome, because these characters, I really felt like they would just go on forever in some ways. Like, even the ones that were dead made such an impact that it's like I would never forget their deaths. Like the doctor getting killed on the knives. Susan, that was the most painful, emotional, and the thing was, what made that so heartbreaking was the romance between her and Ben Mears was just so beautiful. It was like the most beautiful romance Stephen King has ever spoken of in a book. Like, that romance was just so pure and sweet and innocent, and it was just remarkable. And like, you were kind of rooting for him, knowing a bit of his past but not knowing it all. It kind of came to the surface of why it hit him so hard when she got turned into a vampire and then killed later on, when he reveals his past about how his wife had died in a motorcycle accident. So you could really feel it was almost like history repeating, and it was the curse of this Marston house that, brought the vampires there and cursed this town. And everything about this story, I could just go on and on for hours, because this book overall was just my favorite. Like, it just was one that I couldn't say there was anything I didn't like about it. I could sit there and I could say there was something I didn't like about all the other books in this list, but Salem's Lot I'll put it this way, if it's like a coffin, it hit every nail in place and that coffin is perfectly sealed. Or unsealed, how you look at it based on what I said, that it left the world open and unended with the mystery of it, which that is what makes it the masterpiece. Like, at first, like I said, I didn't get it, but that mysterious ending, that is what makes it my favorite Stephen King book of all. So, yeah, Salem's Lot #1. I hope you enjoyed watching this. And until next time, your host, Super Kami Guru Alucard, peace out. And we will continue the reviews next Tuesday, starting with Nightmares and Dreamscapes for our 6. We're going in order to do them all, but this is just the 30 I read so far, top 30. And of course, as we read more, we might revisit this list. It might change depending on, which ones I might like more in the long run. Or, it might just keep growing and it'll stay the same. We'll see as we read more. But till next time, hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you for watching. And yeah, if you want to hear more about Stephen King, check out the other reviews on my channel. Till next time, peace out.